Hey, folks, good evening. It is Wednesday evening, and glad to have you here. And I know that we're running into some conflicts with some of our favorite hosts that are out there, but you know what? We try as best we can to check with each other and see what's going on with schedules, but sometimes it doesn't always work out. That's the beautiful thing of having all these shows archived is that we are able to watch them at any time. I started off when I was doing this a while back, checking with Jeff and checking with Rocky just to make sure we don't overlap each other. Now I do a show with Rocky at 11 o'clock every night, midnight East Coast time. And we check with Jeff, but Jeff does like 18 shows a day. So he just kind of pops on when he's ready to go. And I think he is so busy and so many tens of thousands of followers. I think he just doesn't have time to always check. So we tend to overlap a little bit, but that's okay. So if you can't catch me live, you can catch me in the archives. If you can't catch Jeff live, you can catch him in the archives. But you can catch Rocky and me live at 11 o'clock Central Standard Time, 5 nights a week. That's Monday through Friday, but it's actually, because it's midnight on Sunday night, making it Monday morning. So it's Sunday night through Thursday night are the 5 nights a week that we go. And so, see, I just got a notification right now that Jeff's going live. So there you go. We might have some of you, some might want to go over and see Jeff. Either way, we're both here. We both archive. So I'll be on with Jeff tomorrow night with the Consequential Rapscallions at 9 o'clock, same time as right now. So I won't be doing a show tomorrow night other than with Jeff, unless by any wrench in the gears, Jeff can't make it tomorrow night. I'll be doing a show here then. So there you go. And the three of us just kind of play off of each other, and we work with each other, and we do all this stuff together and try to stay off of people's schedules. But there it is. It exists, and we just work with it. So, coffee. Now, tonight, I have to tell you, I'm going to mention this first of all. It looks like I've been through a beating. That's because I don't know what it is. I think spiders or something bit me here and here. I mentioned it last night. It's like 2 nights ago this happened. And they got me here and here and here and here. And now, and it's here, and now it's here from last night. I'm not complaining about it. It's just, it probably looks bad over there. It's not really all that bad. Couple little spots hurt, and it's all through my scalp here, which is crazy. And it's not ticks or anything like that. The ticks here, of course, they like to stay on your body. You'll find them embedded in your skin. That's not what any of this is. So this is getting worse, I think, through the day. It's just puffing up a little bit more. So who knows? I might be a puffy mess by the time I hit the Rocky Stucci Situation Room in 2 hours. So we'll see what happens there. And I just wanted to let you know that's my little complain moment for the evening. I don't like to complain too much, but like I was saying to a friend of mine not long ago, a contemporary of mine that I grew up with, went to college with, and I said, you know how it's funny when we were younger. We talked about, and you've heard me say this before, if you've listened to me on here on Rocky's show at any time, that when we were younger, we talked about chicks, cars, and cash. And now that we're getting a little older, we're moderately older. We're in our late 50s, pushing 60. Now, instead of talking about the 3 C's, we talk about wounds, surgeries, and broken bones, and physical woes. So times have changed a little bit. So I try not to complain. I don't mind spilling my guts every now and then, say, hey, this hurts and that hurts, and I got this and that. But I don't like to spend lots of time complaining about it. So there you go. I'm more prepping you for this thing is swelling up a little bit more, and And so if I look like I've been in a fight, I really haven't, except it was fighting arachnids somewhere in my sleep. So use paste of water and meat tenderizer on bug bites. Oh, hey, there you go. I'll give that a try. Paste of water and it sounds like a ancient. Use paste of water and meat tenderizer on bug bites. I'll give that a shot. I want to say hey to everybody. Sue's good to see you. And Audrey, I don't know if you're here right now. I think you were here very early on. And nice to have you. And let's see. TT, good to see you. I don't know. Some of you may have gone over to Jeff's channel. That's okay. Travis, I see you're here. Good evening, brother. And Lucky Stone, good to see you. Let's see. Richie, good to see you as well. Sherry Lynn or Sherilyn. Yeah. See, we've gone down we had a whole 7 people. Now we're down to 4. That's the draw of Jeff Dougherty. And I appreciate you're all coming in to watch the videos. We're averaging at the end about 200 views per video. And I appreciate that. That lets me know you like what I'm presenting. We're getting a lot of likes. And this thing will just grow. So spread the word. Like this video down below. Share it. Let people know we're here. And I know as soon as Jeff's done, we'll get a bunch more people come piling in as well. So Travis, teach you controversial things about David. I will do my best, sir. Now, they might not be, to some of you, like perhaps Travis, might not be so controversial because we've already been down this road. We've talked about these things many times, either amongst ourselves or on our own. We've got our questions or the things that we look at. Here's a for instance. I look at somebody like Travis over there. Travis is a high priest, a pagan high priest, for lack of a more simplistic way to put that. So Travis has already gone through and he's made his decisions in life a long time ago, and he knows the direction he's heading. And I respect him for where he is in life. With me, it was a slower process because I was going a direction like Travis is going now, just in a different vein. And when you stop something that you've been doing your whole life, you put the brakes on, and you start shifting to something else or just away from something. You know how sometimes making a change doesn't mean you're necessarily changing to a new thing. You might be just leaving the old because the old no longer cuts it, no longer satisfies, no longer has the answers. And so you back away from that. And that's where I have been for many, well, not many years, a few years. And it's gets better and better and better as we go. Jeremy, how you doing? Good to see you. Had a little conversation with Jeremy earlier this evening. Nice to see you, brother. And who else did I just see that I didn't see? Brenda, good to see you as well. And Sherilyn, I think I said hi a minute ago, but hi again. And so this thing with David is the kind of stuff, as I was mentioning, Travis, might have been some things that he settled himself a long time ago. For me, it took a little longer to come to the points of view I'm going to be offering up tonight because they contradict what I was taught. And here is the big thing about this is that sometimes when you are going through a change or a necessary change, now I'm not talking about I'm angsty against my parents' Methodism, so I'm going to go ahead and shake some acorns this week. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things that have generally when you leave something and you don't really know what direction you're heading in, it's because that thing has grown intolerable for you. There's something about it that no longer works, so you have to back away from it. For either to take another look at it and you may come full circle and end up right back there, or because you need to back away from that. And that's what I started doing because I had lots of questions. And you can tell, those of you who've been here for some of the book readings, that I have had lots of questions about the biblical things that I was taught, the theological things I was taught. Hey, Lewis, how you doing? Patriots Corner. And so these are things, and Suze, you just said this is where you're at. looking at a lot of things, pondering, pruning relationships, and habits of thought, and et cetera. And that's where I came with my faith. And faith is, it's one of those things where I want to say, I haven't completely lost faith. My faith has shifted. There's something different there. And Travis, as long as you're out there, if you're still hearing me, you and I have got to get together on that thing we talked about. So a long time ago, 6 months ago or more. I want to get together with you on that and talk about that sincerely. And no better way to get your attention with that than to say it on public airwaves. So there you go. I'm ready, brother. And I'm ready in more ways than you think. And folks, I'll tell you about that another time. But there's some things I want to work on with Travis. And tonight, there's a book that I read, and I told you about this book a while back. This is not my book, but this is kind of what prompted some of my thoughts. I'm going to give you an idea here of what gave me this idea. Back when I was in the faith, kind of neck deep, I was a youth pastor. I had gone to seminary and Bible college before that. My theology was pretty solid. And if any of you out there have ever heard of a minister by the name of Chuck Swindoll, he did radio ministry for many, many years. He may still, for all I know. He was a radio evangelist, but he was the pastor of a church. Hey, Leslie, how you doing? Good to see you. And Chuck Swindoll was one of those teachers that I wanted to be like in the faith. The way he spoke, the sincerity, the honesty, I wouldn't say he was a no holds barred, because he wasn't a tough guy, even though he had been a former Marine, who I've usually view as tough guys. He had a gentle heart, and he was a good man, and he taught because he wanted people to know things. And he taught a series on David that I listened to a long time ago, and it was very different than what I'm thinking of doing here now. I want to do a little mini series on David. And in contrast to Chuck Swindoll, I looked at this book, which was, and I just mentioned this, it's the historical David, and it's subtitled The Real Life of an Invented Hero. And this is by Joel Baden, who is a Yale Hebrew religion professor at Yale University. And he wrote this book a few years ago. And it was his take on King David from a very different point of view. One of being, he's Jewish. Joel Baden is Jewish. His view of David was one that was established when he was a kid back in synagogue. And he said there's no reason, he says in his book, to believe that David didn't exist. He says, I think to minimalize him that much is a mistake on many people's part. However, he said, I want to talk in his book. He said, I want to talk about how David, I think, is a real person who has become an invented hero, and that his whole story in the Bible, which really spans from, I think it's like 1 Samuel 14 all the way through 1 Kings 6, something like that. I'll explain that in a minute. All those chapters, much of it is an apologetic about David. And if you don't know what an apologetic is, let me do this. I'm going to do a Jeff Dougherty here, only without the screen power to back it up. Apologetic, by definition, is a regretfully acknowledging or excusing an offense or a failure. Now that's well, I'm sorry. That's the dictionary definition of apologizing and apologetic. Now, apologetics as a discipline is the religious discipline of defending religious doctrines through systematic argumentation and discourse. Early Christian writers who defended their beliefs against critics and recommended their faith to outsiders were called Christian apologists. In 21st century usage, apologetics is often identified with debates over religion and theology. And you will have to pardon me, I'm not going to hit my cough button every time I cough tonight. I've still got this naggy, dry allergy-driven cough. A couple of my kids have had it for a couple of weeks along with me, and it's scratchy. So pardon me if I cough through tonight. And that'll be recorded and archived for posterity as well. So apologetics is what you find about the story of David in the Bible. There are so many. Here's an example of an apologetic. Would be David. Let's start with there's a story I want to start with, and I'm going to kind of leave the character names out of this to start with, but this is a story out of the Old Testament, and it's in these passages about David. And there was this small village in Israel, and it's about 3,000 years ago. And there was a man and his wife who owned a flock of sheep and goats, and they grazed the fields in some distance from the village where they lived. And one spring day, 10 men appeared in this village. Now listen to the story here. 10 men appeared in the village. They were messengers from a larger gang of fugitives from society who roamed the countryside, living as they could. In a way, you could almost think Robin Hood-esque and his merry men. So get that picture in your mind. Some of Robin's merry men are appearing to the rich man who owns flocks, and they appeared to him and they said, "Look, we're representing the leader of our gang, and he has a request. We've been protecting your flocks and your shepherds out in the fields, and no harm have come to them or to your property. So now these guys wanted to have the man give them some money and food for their efforts." So there's the beginnings of the basics of the story. Guy has flocks. Suddenly, out of nowhere, 10 guys show up and say, "Hey, our boss of our gang, and we have been protecting you. We've been offering you protection. We've been protecting your shepherds. Sometimes you didn't even know we were there. And now we'd like to get some money. And the boss says he'd like some food, too." It sounds a little bit like Rocky talking. Hey, we did a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And, we want to get something down for it. Sue says it's a shakedown. Makes for good radio, says Travis. And so as the story goes on, the man who had never encountered this gang before, much less asked them to protect his property or provide any kind of protection or anything, refused. He wasn't going to give them a damn thing. And he turned them away. And the next day now, 1 day's passed, the leader of the gang shows up at the man's door himself, but this time he's got his full entourage, which, according to this biblical story, at this time he had over 300 men that were the dispossessed, those who owed taxes, those who were wanted. They all gathered themselves in the wilderness to this man and followed him. Again, a Robin Hood figure comes to mind, an archetypical character, hero. So, but now 300 to 400 men, I'm sorry. And so he shows up at their door, and they're all armed to the teeth. And shortly thereafter, the man who refused to pay them, give them food for protection, is dead. There he lays dead on the ground. The gang leader then, very shortly afterwards, married the guy's wife, his widow, and thereby assumed the legal ownership of the man's flocks and servants and his houses, his fields, and all of this stuff. Now, what do you make of this sequence of events? If this were a modern court case, the circumstantial evidence against the gang leader would look pretty bad, wouldn't it? Hey, we're going to give you protection. The guy says, give us some food, some money. The guy says no. Boss man comes back. Man ends up dead. Boss man marries widow, assumes all the property under the cultural traditions of that day, and gets all the guy's stuff. Meanwhile, guy's still dead. And it would look like a classic protection racket is what that would look like. And the initial message from the gang would be seen as a thinly veiled threat that's embodied in the gang leader's appearance with his armed men and fulfilled in the end in the man's death. And the device of marrying the widow could be really understood as a legal means of justifying the acquisition of the guy's land, and essentially a cover-up. And the widow taken by force. After all, her husband lays dead before her, and she's surrounded by his killers, and would be as much a victim of the dead man himself. Now, in the story, her name is Abigail. And according to the story in the scriptures, she's pretty hot. She's a looker, so to speak. And of course, David is the gang leader. And this is a period of David's life when he is on his run from King Saul, who is seeking to take his life because, according to the story, David had been anointed in his place to become the next king by the prophet of Israel. All right? Now you getting all this? And David, who is on the run from the rightful king, who God has said he's going to tear the kingdom from prophetically, and David's going to take over. This is after the period of time where David had his scenario with Goliath of Gath, the giant. This is after David is the captain of the king's bodyguard. This is after he forges a relationship with the king's son, the prince, Jonathan. This is after twice or three times the king tried to kill him in his madness. According to the scripture, the madness of the king drove him to try to kill David. This is after David has married the daughter of the king, which all these things start solidifying his claim to the throne. Yet David still is this guy who keeps presenting himself through the story as being, that is God's anointed king, I will not touch him. But everything he's laying in place is something that draws him closer and closer to having a powerful claim to the throne of Israel. Now, of course, as we know, if you know the story, Saul tries to kill him a couple of times. David runs off with the clothes on his back. He runs out to, think Robin Hood again, he runs out to the Greenwood. And there he becomes an outlaw from the king. And he gathers to himself this band of merry men, all of whom are the dispossessed, the impoverished, those who owe their taxes and can't pay, those who are in debt, those who have committed crimes. They all go to the Greenwood with David, which you're in the Judean hillside, and so it's pretty forested land at the time. So you're probably looking at something that's got a very similar picture to the Robin Hood picture. And now he's out. He's what would be, let's try to put it in a pretty light. David, in order to survive and feed his men, is giving protection to the local shepherds and saying, we're taking care of your sheep. We're making sure that invaders don't come in and kill them. We're protecting your shepherds. So give us a little bit of money so we can put some clothes on our back. Give us some food and we'll continue doing this. And thank you, sir, for your kindness to us. When in reality, as it's been said a couple of times, hey, Michelle, how you doing? Faye, good to see you as well. And Jeremy, if I didn't see you already. Jim Pratt, good to see you, brother. What's really going on here is what looks like an extortion ring. You've seen it in all the cop shows. If you haven't been the victim of it because you own a little shop like in the city or something, where the gang members come by and they start tipping your goods down on the floor and breaking them up in your shop and saying, oh, we're so sorry we did that. Now we can make sure that never happens to you if you give us, like $500 a week, extortion. And in essence, this is what David did. And so this is a story now that what you've got here, this is the basis of an apologetic that is being written about David. And this apologetic is not painting him in the light as a would-be killer, who the wife and the guy who died are victims of his extortion. Though it might be the most plausible explanation given the information we have, this is only one possible way of explaining the events. And how we understand what happened, what meaning we make of a plan, or of this case, and that we make of the plain series of events that took place, depends greatly on who's telling the story and why they're telling it. Because the guy who died might posthumously give you the story, and this asshole came by and he demanded money from me and this and that, and he ends up having a stroke and he dies. And as so often the case, particularly with events from the distant past, we don't have this objective reconstruction of the story. We have no court records as to what happened, no eyewitness accounts other than the people who are writing the story, if they're the ones writing the story. We have only a single version of events, and that's one that's counterintuitive. It presents the gang leader as the hero. This is what we find in the Bible. And the dead man is the villain. For 3,000 years, it's this version of this story that's been taken unquestioningly as the truth of the events there. For this story comes from the Bible. It's a biblical tale. And the gang leader was none other than King David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, as the Bible calls him, the man after God's own heart, as the Bible also calls him. He is the future king of Israel. All those things. So now this is the story that's given. And so the apologetic in this is that David is doing something good. He's the good guy. He's saving the wife, Abigail, from the nasty husband who obviously victimizes her. He is doing good things in the name of the Lord to protect the Lord's people, and this guy's flocks and all of his shepherds. Yet there's nothing about extortion mentioned when he says that. It's him doing this out of the goodness of his heart. And please, oh please, as Tiny Tim might say, please bless us with some food and some money, some rare coin. I don't think it was anything like that, is what we're getting. And so the life of David is something that has become very interesting to me, because he used to be a hero of mine of the Bible. And I think you can have those. You can have those heroes of literature. I believed he was a real guy, and I still believe he was a real guy. But I believe much of what I believed about him was made up by those around him because they were creating an apologetic. Let's see. I'm just seeing what some of the bunch of comments just threw up. Rocky Balboa, that's what he did, down at the docks. And beginning of the mafia. Doherty's had enough mods over there, so happy to be here. Glad you're here, Michelle. And Travis, indeed, I'm here too, just relaxing. Yeah, kick back. Come on. God rolls gangs, son. That's right. And let's see. Maz, the big cannoli, Rocky Stochi's in the house, everyone. So shut up. So good to have you here, Rocky. And good to see you. And so as we go on with this, our the only pictures really that we got, look at it this way. We get these pictures of what these biblical characters were like because of the way they were presented to us, either in Sunday school or look at Michelangelo and his sculpture of the naked David in white marble. And we had this picture of him. But then there's like Moses, who beyond like the statue of Michelangelo's, Cecil B. DeMille. Kids watching The Prince of Egypt, made by DreamWorks. It's all rendered in full color, and we get these pictures of what some of these heroes were like, from the burning bush to the plagues, which we just went through with the Exodus reality. All of these things, and our knowledge of David exists not as a full-length film, but as kind of these short little snippets and these still frames we get of him from the biblical story. We see David and Goliath, although much has been put on film about that event, all different kinds of versions. We get these snippets of what he's like. We get these visuals in our head. And he fights the big giant carrying nothing but a sling and a stone. And we see Goliath towering over the Israelite army. And remember, there was, and some of this I got from Swindoll in my studies. Remember, I mentioned Charles Swindoll, Chuck Swindoll. When I listened to his series about David back 25 to 30 years ago on tape while I'd be driving, and I'd listen to his series, and it was a sweet, I wouldn't have called it apologetic back then, but the sweet stories of David. I remember one of the messages he taught, and this was, he would teach his church from the pulpit, and he would teach these stories, and they put them into these tape series. And one of these stories about David he called Life in the Cave. If you know anything about the story of David, in those years between when he was running from Saul, the king, for his life, and when he actually took over as king, I think it was something like 9 years or something. He was out in the wilderness running from King Saul. And for 3 years of that time, he lived in a cave. The scripture calls it the cave of Machpelah. And you know what? You can go see that cave today. It's there. It's out in the wilderness. It's been there. It's been a landmark for almost 3,000 years. So the cave is actually still there. And there's no doubt that this is the cave mentioned in the story. And I don't think there's any doubt to really believe that it was the cave that David lived in. But there was a time where he was writing psalms and doing these things, but there was a 3-year period where he completely left off. And Swindoll had this message he put together called Life in the Cave. And he talked about David being despondent, having fallen into discouragement. And you see it in some of the Psalms he had written, where he writes to God and he says all these things about you've called me out, and yet my life is a trap. All those who seek my life, they say, why do the wicked seem to win, and those who are your called people seem to fail so much? And he would bring all these psalms out, and he talked about this life in the cave. And so I learned about David from a very different point of view, and I grew to love the character of David and the character as presented in the scripture. But then as I found myself drifting further away from the faith of my youth, I would find that there were other aspects to these stories that I didn't know before and that I didn't understand. And one of them was understanding David and how much of his life was truly an apologetic, where the writers were attempting to establish for Israel their history, and that the second king of their monarchy, King David, Saul was the first, that this king was somebody who was pursuing God's heart, that he was always and ever somebody who loved God and wanted to serve God, and that God was always at the forefront of his mind, and that if there were any deeds he committed that we might look at askance and go, oh, David, what did he do that for? He just committed adultery, and he sent the woman's husband to the forefront of the line to be killed in battle because he wouldn't sleep with his wife to cover up the fact that David got her pregnant. That's a bad thing, by biblical standards. And yet, because of David's response, which is an apologetic, his prayer to God is listed. But of course, it says he wrote it down as a psalm. So there's this heartfelt prayer, and then he writes it down as a song. And you know what I want to do? Hang on. I'm still here. I'm getting up because I want to grab something that's not sitting on my desk at the moment. So hang on. It's right here. I happened to find this the other day while I was going through boxes and boxes of old books that I hadn't unpacked in a long, long time. And this is an old Bible I was given. back when I was a kid. I became a born-again Christian at age 11. And there was an old guy that gave me this Bible that he was more than an old guy. He really became my mentor for many years, and until he passed away. But I wanted to read you something, and this is a King James Bible. And I just want you to see this. This Bible is so marked up, underlined, things written in the margins. This is all stuff that I wrote in there as I was growing in my faith and wanting to learn things. But I want to read you something. In the book of Psalms, make sure I'm going in the right direction here. Psalm 51. When David, I want to make a point with this, and I want you to hear how beautiful this is. Just because I think that there are apologetics here does not mean the literature contained in here is worthless and doesn't mean anything, and it has no pathos or emotion. But this is something that David wrote when he had sinned against God. If you remember the story, his troops are all out fighting against the Philistines, and he's home. He's not out in battle leading his army. And he's on the rooftop one night, and he looks over and he sees this beautiful woman bathing in the moonlight in her house, in her yard. However they had it, she was in some place where she's bathing, and he can see her from the rooftop. And it's if you remember the song Hallelujah, a very famous Cohen song, Leonard Cohen song. There's that verse that says, your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof. Her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. That's what this is talking about. And so he has sex with this woman, calls for her, she comes in, bing, bang, boom, done. She has sex with the king. It doesn't comment on whether or not she enjoys it or not, but it does say they eventually end up married. She eventually becomes the mother of Solomon, David's son. But in this intermediary stage, this beginning stage, they have sex. She comes and tells him, I'm pregnant. And so David calls his captain home. Her husband was Uriah. And he's the captain, one of the captains in David's army. And David wants him to go home and sleep with his wife. Go home and sleep with your wife. Have sex with your wife. Dude, welcome home on leave. And there's, Uriah's like, why am I home? There's a battle going on. And David says, I just want you to come home. I want to celebrate the fact that you're doing a good job for me. Pat on the back. Now, why don't you go on home? Your wife is waiting for you. Go visit her, and you can go back to war tomorrow. Well, Uriah, as the biblical story says, is so committed to his King David and his troops, he won't go home. David gets up in the morning and finds out Uriah slept on the floor of the palace with his troops. He said, who am I? And David said, why didn't you go home last night? And Uriah says, how could I go home and enjoy my wife and my family when my troops are here? We're here to serve you, my king. So David's like, go get back to the front. And then he pulls his general aside and he says, when you get back there in the heaviest of the fighting, I want you to take and move Uriah and his troops to the front of the fight. And when it becomes the heaviest, I want you to withdraw, leaving Uriah there. And so what happens is Uriah is killed in battle. So David no longer has to worry about him. Neither does Bathsheba, his wife. David marries Bathsheba. The rest of the story is there. By the way, somebody just asked me, Leslie, did Rocky hit you in the head with his bat? No, Rocky can only hit himself in the head with his own bat. That's what I mentioned when I got in here. I look a little beat up. I got bit by something a couple of nights ago, and it bit me all over the place on this side of my head. So they're still healing up. So I don't even know what it was. They're big, knobby welts and stuff, and they still hurt, some of them. So I don't know what it was. Something attacked me in my sleep. I don't know what it was. It wasn't a mosquito, that's for sure. So wash the hands. Yeah. Are you talking about the David story, Travis, or me? So So David gets Bathsheba. Now, along in the story, the prophet Nathan comes to David in the narrative, and he says, I have a matter of judgment for the king. And so David says, tell me what's up. Nathan says, there's a man in your kingdom. He said, he's a rich man, and he has a big feast with all his friends. And he has a servant who has one wee lamb. And he loves this lamb like his own family. It's like a child to him. It sleeps in his bed at night. We won't go into the implications of him being Scottish or anything like that. So it sleeps with him in his bed at night. And he loves this lamb. His master has thousands of sheep. Well, the master has guests coming, and rather than take one of his own sheep, he sends and he has his servant's lamb taken from him, and he kills the lamb and serves that up to his guests. And the man falls into grief. And so Nathan the prophet says to the king, to David, he says, what's your judgment in this matter? And David, he's all pissed off by this. And he says, that man should surely die for doing this. And then the famous line, Nathan says, thou art the man. And then right away, it's supposed to hit David like a ton of bricks what he's talking about. And Nathan says, because of what you've done, he says, the child that is born to you will not live. So God takes it out on the unborn child. And when the child's born, the child's going to die because of David's sin. And he says, he said, the sword will never depart from your house all the days of your life. And so David repents and he cries out to God. Now, this is what I'm getting at. This is the prayer he wrote, all that buildup, and it's in Psalm 51. Turn in your Bibles to Psalm 51. I'm going to read this for you. Now, I prefer a different version of the Bible, but I love the poetic nature of it in the King James. And this is Psalm 51. It says, to the chief musician, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came unto him after he had gone in to Bathsheba. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee and thee only have I sinned and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest, and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins, and blot out all mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God, thou God of my satisfaction, or my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of thy righteousness. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. For thou desirest not sacrifice, else I would give it. Thou delightest not in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion. Build thou the walls of Jerusalem, and then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offerings, and with burnt offering, and with whole burnt offering, and then they offer bullock upon thine altar. Now that was the prayer of David which he had set to music. Imagine like the lyre or the harp, very rudimentary instrument back then, but a stringed instrument that he wrote this for. And I know the verses that had always hit us and that we had always used in ministry and teaching and preaching: purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. So now, this is the sweet psalm that David wrote. But I believe this is part of the apologetic that is set up to show what kind of man the Bible writers or the priests wanted you to know about David. Not so much that he had sinned, or that he had sinned and that he had moved on from that. So, sacrifice of a broken spirit, that's a nugget. Very true, Travis. So there you go. This is the picture of David that the apologistic writers wanted you to have. Now, as we go on in this and think about this from, I want to get into this little section where we hear David recounting his tales of fighting. He fought off lions. It says he fought off bears to protect his family. And now he's fighting to fight off people from stealing Nabal's sheep, and the guy dies and he marries his wife after extorting him. Remember in the scene with Goliath, David comes to the camp, and all his older brothers are there fighting in the armies of King Saul. David is the youngest, and he's left at home to tend the flocks. We always get this picture of a boy. David was probably late teens, early 20s when this took place. So David comes, his father sends him with food for his brothers. So in a sense, he's going out to the battlefield to bring lunch to his bros. And they've been for 40 days already at this point. They've been fighting the Philistines. And it's at the Valley of Elah. And you can still go there today. It's an empty valley, shallow valley with low hills to either side. As a matter of fact, the Philistine encampment can still be found there archaeologically. There's a lot of historical evidence that battles took place here during the time of David, 3,000 years ago. So you've got this champion of the Philistines, Goliath, who had said he would come down on the opposite hill from where Israel was encamped on this side of the valley, up on the hill. Goliath would come down, it said, and he would taunt Israel, yelling across the valley, "Send out your champion to fight me, and whoever wins will win the day." Well, nobody from Israel wants to volunteer and go fight this guy, who is a big guy. Goliath, 6 cubits in a span, it says he was, which we talked about this when we were reading some of the books, and I think we just covered this the other day. 6 cubits in a span is roughly 9 to 10 feet tall. And what we don't know is if that included his tall Philistine helmet or if this is the size of the guy. He was a big guy, a little over 9 feet tall. And he's taunting. I don't think he was a victim of giantitis or giantess or anything like that, because most of those people, as they grow older, their bones grow more brittle and they're weaker than the normal man. The biblical account says he was a warrior from the days of his youth. And this guy's coming in and is very intimidating. And so David arrives on the scene with lunch for his brothers. And as the scene writes it out, David says, "Who is this guy that he's taunting the armies of Israel of the one true God?" And, and his brothers tell him to go back home, tend the sheep. What are you doing here? And well, as the event unfolds, David, of course, ends up, the king wants him to go out, and he accepts David's offer. And the king had offered 3 things. Whoever could slay this giant he would end up being the captain of the king's bodyguard. He would be tax-free along with his family in Israel all his days, and he would get the daughter's daughter to marry. Those 3 things were promised. And so David goes out and he fights the giant with a stone. 1 shot, boom, gone, according to the passage. Takes the head of the giant. It says that David took the giant's sword and cut his head from his body, and that he took Goliath's head and sword with him to Jerusalem. Now, the interesting historical point there is that David didn't even conquer Jerusalem until after he was king. And so it was another 13 years before David conquered the city of Salem, and it became Jerusalem. And he took Goliath's head and sword with him there. So he had this head for at least 13 years that we know of, along with the sword of Goliath. So this is this story as it's written about David. This is the kind of person he was. And there's more apologetic that comes as we'll go through the story of David's life in this series. You're going to see a whole lot more about this. Now, from Goliath's death in David's life, I just want to give you a bit of an overview here. We fast forward to David sitting on the throne of Israel, and not merely as king, but as the composer of the immortal Psalms. If you go to the book of Psalms, many of them are attributed to David. He has a lyre in his hand and the emblem of the great poet. Perhaps he's speaking those lines most familiar to us from the King James Bible, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And so on. And this is David at rest, the stately ruler of a peaceful realm. He's offering his praises to God, who granted him victory over Israel's enemies and who spared him from disaster. And these are the two moments that best represent David in the popular imagination. But there's far more to his story, because the full narrative of his life takes up 42 chapters in the Bible. It's spanning from 1 Samuel 16 to 1 Kings 2. And the story of Goliath only takes up one chapter. And the writing of the Psalms is, in fact, nowhere in the narrative at all. So there's much more to tell of David in all this chapter space. And the details of the biblical account of David's life, even those that we're familiar with, are largely subsumed by the idea of David, an abstracted, romanticized, idealized figure. He's less a person of flesh and blood than he is this symbol of this great nation. He's the nation's glorious past, the promising future. This is who he is. And we may know Moses better through the Exodus account. We know more about Moses, but we love David more if you are a follower of these stories in the Bible. There was a simple one-line song that was taught in Hebrew school, and it went like this. It said in Hebrew, it said, David Melech Yisrael Chai Chai Vechayim. And what that means is David, King of Israel, lives and endures. And the song has no story behind it. There's nothing to be learned about David's life from those 5 words. But what they represent was what was being instilled in kids in synagogue, in believers in general of the Jewish faith. And that's David's status in their tradition and in their history. Too young to understand it, most kids who heard that, but it's noteworthy that the song describes David not as a figure of the past, but part of their present. That's who he had become in their literature. This whole David, Melech Yisrael, Chai Chai, Vechayim had become part of who he was in the present. They can't be used to describe a mere king from 3,000 years ago. Nor for that matter would they be used to describe a mere man that would be inappropriate from any other character in the Hebrew Bible. And we'd never say that Moses lives and endures forever, or Abraham, or Jacob, Israel, or Isaiah. All of these figures had to have legends attached to them, but David's is uniquely timeless. He is the King of Kings. And some of this is because there's this idea that's commonly associated with David, though it's one without any visual imagery, and that's his role as the head of the lineage that leads to the Messiah. Now, when you looked at prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament, they never said there was going to be a king who comes first, who will be the famous king of Israel, from whose loins shall spurt the seed of the line of the Messiah. We're not told that. But when we get all the way up to the life of Jesus in the New Testament, they take the life of Mary, his mother, and suddenly she is traceable back to King David. And not only her, his blood mother, but Joseph, the supposed stepfather, because God is Jesus' father, according to the scripture, the New Testament scripture. So, but they can also trace Joseph back to King David. So, in other words, what have you got here in Jesus? You've got somebody who is the legal heir to the throne of David. Now, I find that very interesting. The Messiah, after the time of David, needed to sprout from the root of Jesse, as they called it, Jesse being David's father. So this character needed to be the Messiah in the line of the Messiah. The Messiah needed to be from the line of David. And so this is what is meant when it's talking about, even in the Jewish sense, that David would be somebody who would someday, his lineage would produce the Messiah. To the Jews, the Messiah who is not yet come. To the Christians, the Messiah that's already been here. It says in 2 Samuel 7:16, God promises David an everlasting kingship. It says, your house and your kingdom shall be secure before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, as the prophets of Israel began to look ahead to the messianic future, it was only natural that they should imagine the future redemptive king as one from David's line. And thus Isaiah, the prophet, a few years later than David, famously announces the birth of the shoot from the stump of Jesse, who will rule in peace without end upon David's throne and upon his kingdom. That's in Isaiah 11, 1 and 9:6. And Jeremiah speaks of the time when God will raise up a righteous branch of David's line. Jeremiah 23:5. And even more explicitly describes the time of Israel's restoration as one when they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. And Ezekiel the prophet similarly foresees the return of David in the Messianic era. I will appoint over them a single shepherd to tend them, my servant David. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be ruler among them. And of course, the way they're saying this resurrected David will come is through the seed, the bloodline of David, the Messiah. Now, if you go back to what we were talking about the Nephilim, and I said the story of the Nephilim in the Old Testament is really the story of the Messiah is really a story that's piggybacking the story of a bloodline that's been separated, a twin bloodline, dual bloodline in the Old Testament. One of a pure human bloodline that bequeathed the Messiah, one of a tainted bloodline that the Messiah could not come from. And I remember I said back then, if the Bible in the Old Testament kept saying over and over and over and over and over and over again that the Messiah must come, the kinsman redeemer must come from the pure line of humanity. It must come from the line of Abraham, must come from the line of Adam. After the time of David, must come from the line of David. It's obviating that there is another line, that opposite line. If the Messiah had to spring from the kinsman redeemer, the one who was one of us redeemer, it's obviating that there was a line that couldn't be hailed to because it was not of the pure human bloodline. So all of this stuff starts to tie together in David. Now, early Jewish traditions from the first century, the Messiah was known as the Son of David. And it's a title that continued to be used in the Talmud. It's most famous from the New Testament, where it's used 15 times in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Son of David, he's called. And an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of David. In the Gospel of John, we read, "Has not the scripture said that the Messiah is descended from David?" Jesus is said to be descended from David according to the flesh in the book of Romans, a descendant of David, 2 Timothy, and the root and descendant of David in Revelation 22. In the book of Acts, a brief history of Israel is recounted, beginning with the Exodus, and telling of which, notably, Moses is not even mentioned in the book, in the recounting of the Exodus. And it's culminating with David. Because of this man's posterity, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus, as he promised, according to the book of Acts. In Christianity, Moses, as the preeminent lawgiver, is really downplayed, if not outright rejected, while David is raised up to be something really special. That sounds stupid to say he's really special. He was just raised up to be very important. The legend of David is deeply woven into this whole fabric of Western culture. And one needs to think merely of the range and the frequency of uses to which David and Goliath comparison is put to. This particular image, certainly the most dramatic from the story of David, resonates deeply with all of us and with a lot of people in a lot of settings. It's a Goliath story. It's a David and Goliath story. You know, the underdog up against the great giant. And Israel, the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, the 6-Day War of 67, were at the time and would have been since portrayed as a modern David and Goliath story by their own words. Israel plays the role of David, and in 1948, the small, largely ineffective, but noisy mortars that Israel deployed against their Arab enemies were called Davidkas, or Little Davids. That's nothing. It's relating to the story is what it is. You know, you can even go so far as, not surprisingly, this very same rhetoric of David and Goliath has entered the political discourse of modern day, of current day. Members of the conservative Tea Party have characterized themselves as David fighting the Goliath of liberal media. Boom, there you go. So it's human for us. It's natural for us to idolize or idealize these figures from our past. You can think of probably 100 of them right now if I put it out there and asked for it. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, in our own country's history, Abraham Lincoln, of course, all of these people. And we remember them and we ascribe great legends to them of who they were and what they were really like. Were these men of stature? And I got to ask you this, and I believe some of these men were really great men of integrity. But would you wait? Let me say this first before I address that. Would you say that George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson, these were men who were like, I am George Washington, and this is who I am. And they never faltered. They never fell. They were heroes of great renown. We've elevated them to that in legendary status in our minds. What real history does is allow us to peel back the layers a bit and see what these guys were really like. There are to some extent, some apologetics applied to some of our own heroes, our modern day heroes. Can you think of one? Put it in the chat room if you're here. If you can think of a hero somebody that we hold in our own history to be somebody amazing, and we forget that they're real people because we put an apologetic patina on them. Becky says, isn't David and Goliath about ego? Conquering ego, and that's an interpretation is what that is. I would say, Becky, that I believe the story of David and Goliath to be a real one, rooted in a real historical event. The question is, do we understand and know the story for what it really was? That's a story that was passed down in Israel's history. Thank you, Jim. I might try that. I'm getting stuffy even as I'm talking. So it's allergies is all it is, guys. And my kids are suffering from it too. So all of this to say, can you think of a character? Put it in the chat room. We don't have to discuss them, but throw them up there. Just people that you know, that you look back in history and go, there's an apologetic coding that we give these people because we want them to be our heroes. We don't necessarily always want to see them in the bad light or the negative light. I think of Thomas Jefferson. Love Thomas Jefferson. Love him politically. Love his work. Love his writing. But there's a great apologetic about Thomas Jefferson. We start to lift the layers, and you look at a bit of the seedy underbelly. He was a guy who owned slaves. There was supposedly he and Sally Hemings that he fathered children with one of his slave women, and so on. But that he was also a man who wanted to do away with slavery, but was in a sense a product of his times, and he realized that. So there was a great paradox with the man. I don't think this made him a lesser person. Although some people have said this is the seedy underbelly of him, I think he would probably let it be known and say, this is who I was. So David left man behind and worshiped God. How he dealt with man was inconsequential. There was no sin in how he dealt with man. Now, Richie, you're talking about David there? Yeah, King Solomon, Travis. Now, Travis, I want to get back to what you said there, Richie. But Travis, you would know more about King David from your point of view within the Masons. There's more information there about Solomon. I would see Solomon as somebody who supposedly the apologetic about him in the scripture was when God said, ask anything you want of me. And Solomon says, I want to know perfect wisdom and be a ruler that rules from wisdom. Okay, so God gave him that according to the scripture. But remember, Solomon also fell into great sin in his life. And remember in the book of Ecclesiastes how he says in that book, he's an old man. He says, I was young and now I'm old. He says, there wasn't a thing I would put my hand to that I could not have. It said he had, 1,000 wives and 700 concubines was the rounded figure, meaning he was pretty wealthy. And he had everything he ever wanted. And he says in the book of Ecclesiastes, remember now your creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come. He says, in a way, in his dotage, he's starting to say, don't do what I did. Remember God while you're young. And don't come back to him because you might not have that opportunity, kind of thing. So, oh boy, another blockbuster situation room tonight. Yeah, it's going to be there tonight. And there's Rocky hammering that point home. As soon as we're done here, I'm not going to go too much longer, folks. You're going to get a nice little break, and you can go over and get prepared for Rocky Stucci's Situation Room. We'll be there tonight in our full glory if I survive the evening. And so be prepared to go over there tonight. Lewis says, Alex Jones. Is that your hero, Alex? So all of this to say is that we have these patinaed heroes, and it's human nature to idealize them. Now, if this idealization happens with the founders of a nation barely 200 years old, I'm talking about America, we're a little over 200 years old, almost 250 years old. If it happens in our nation that's barely 250 years old, with Washington, with Lincoln, with Jefferson, and these guys, how much more so with the founder of the Messianic line that started 3,000 years ago with David? Now, that's not where the Messianic line began. It just says that you'd be able to trace his line back to David or to the King David. And in the case of David, we have both. He's the founder of the nation of Israel and the ancestor, even for some, the prototype of the Messiah. And it's thus not surprising that those aspects of David's life that are known are those that attest to his glory. It's his youthful bravery, his lasting poetry, his empirical kingship. It's similarly unsurprising that the most famous description of David, stated first in the Hebrew Bible and repeated in the New Testament, is that he was a man after God's own heart, is what they call him. The man chasing after God's heart. Now, I'm not saying that didn't exist in David, but it's an idealized cultural memory of who he is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it serves the important purpose of providing a model for the Messiah and for ourselves as people and as communities of faith. We leave the historical David into the past, and in his place we admire an eternal David that's constructed of our own hopes and aspirations. And the construction, here it is, the construction of this idealized David is not a recent phenomenon. It's not something we've just done in recent centuries. It began already in the earliest writings about David. So I'm talking about the apologetics. As an illustration, we may return to the story to begin with, recalling the salient features at the beginning of all of this. That David, at this point in his life, the leader of a band of fugitives, a Robin Hood type character, living in the Greenwood, on the run from the king, with 300 to 400 band of 300 to 400 men that had gathered themselves to him. They're living out in the wilderness. He is not the king yet. This is the situation he's in. Remember, think of Robin Hood. And he sent some of his men to request food or money from a wealthy man in exchange for having been protected. Little extortion, a little Rocky Stucci, and Knuckles and Fat Tony coming to say, hey, we've been taking care of your shop. You don't know who we are, but we're the guys that making sure you don't get any thievery in your shop. And should you, we will take care of that. Now give us some money. This is what David did. And the guy who, of course, owned the flocks gets so pissed off, he goes apoplectic and he falls over dead of a stroke. David marries the widow, acquires all the land of this guy. Now, there are probably innumerable ways to fill in all the gaps in this story and the sequence of events, but none, it is safe to say, could be as tilted in David's favor as the biblical version of that story. And according to 1 Samuel, the man's name who owned all these sheep that David was protecting was Nabal. And his name already predisposes the reader against him. He's the villain and David's the hero. You know what Nabal means in the Hebrew? It just means fool. So it's not even the guy's real name, or if it was his real name, is thanks, Mom and Dad, for the name, Nabal. Thanks. What's more, he's described upon his introduction to the story as a severe and evil man. And his wife, on the other hand, Abigail, is called clever and beautiful. Thereby is setting up the reader for what's to follow. When David's men speak to Nabal, they do it with the utmost politeness. It's formal greetings and obsequious expressions. It's like, oh, we're protecting your sheep, and we'd very much like it, sir, if you could spare a few coins for us and perhaps some food for the services we've rendered. And Nabal, however, responds coldly. He's pissed off. He basically flips him off. And he's even aggressive. And he accuses David of being no more better than a runaway slave. Because he knows the story of David. David's running from the king. And David's claim of having protected Nabal's shepherds, though it's clear that Nabal never requested this service from David and his men, is justified by the unsolicited speech delivered to Abigail of an unarmed shepherd who confirms that David had indeed protected Nabal's men. Oh, I'm a shepherd, and I know. I saw him protect your sheep. and your shepherds, and who throws in this insult to Nabal in the process. He's such a base fellow that none can speak to him. And this is a remarkable exchange that follows between Abigail and David, in which she also insults her husband. Now remember, extortion. Nabal gets pissed off, blows a gasket, dies on the spot of a stroke. David comes in to scoop up the beautiful and intelligent Abigail, and she says, pay no attention to that base fellow. His name means boor, and he is a boor. And perhaps David to the skies, even going so far as to predict, like a prophetess, his eventual reign over Israel. And she gives David and his men an elaborate gift. Oh, by the way, that's what kills Nabal. Not him getting pissed just about David. His wife behind his back, after he tells him, get the fuck off my property, I don't owe you a goddamn penny, sends them on their way, swearing for emphasis. Sounds right. And she gives David and his men this elaborate gift, and to make up for Nabal's stinginess, and she effectively condemns her husband. She says, because David, remember, and his men were coming back to wipe Nabal off the map with all his men. And what does Abigail do? She loads up a bunch of donkeys full of food, full of riches, full of gold, full of all this. So obviously Nabal had some dough. She meets David on the way with his men. He's mounted up on his horse, and he's got all his men, their swords jangling in as they're riding. They stop to meet her because she's beautiful and intelligent, you know. And she gives him this whole spread and says, don't take it out on my husband. He's an idiot. He's a bore. He's a fool. Blah, blah, blah. And though David admits that he's intended to do harm to Nabal, how could he say otherwise? Standing there with 400 armed men, what would he do? Stand there with all his guys with their swords behind him, going, kick the dirt and go, well, we're just going to, we weren't going to hurt him. Just going to talk to him a little. We're going to talk to him a little bit. As Rocky might say, forget about it. We're just going to talk. And so they were going to assassinate the dude, right, Jeremy? They were there to do a little bit of menace to this guy. And so, and I said menace because I just saw macabre menace. Thank you for that, by the way. And so here's the story as it's unfolding now. And he's got his 400 armed men, and he makes it eminently clear that he's going to no longer attack. And thus it's truly miraculous coincidence when 10 days later, God strikes down Nabal and he dies. Boom. He's gone. And the meaning of this whole divinely ordained death is proclaimed by none other than David himself when he says, the Lord has brought Nabal's evil down to his own head. And in the very next moment, David sends his men to propose marriage to Abigail, which she accepts without hesitation. By the way, remember, David's already married to the king's daughter, Micah. So Abigail foresaw in what she said, David's rise to power. They knew who he was, no matter what this story is. If it's an apologetic. So here's the apologetic. They've whitewashed who David was in this story to make him look better as the coming king of Israel. So without altering the basic sequence of events, the biblical version of what happened dramatically tilts the moral balance of the story. This is apologetics at work. Nabal, the ostensible injured party, is the one who ends up dead. And he's positioned as the bad guy in this story, as the evildoer, the nasty, the fool, the idiot, the bore, as his wife calls him. Thanks a lot, guys. How would you like to find out your wife says, don't hurt my husband. He's an idiot. He's a fool. He's a bore. That's what she thought of him. And David, the ostensible aggressor, he's rendered as the aggrieved party. He's the one who's hurt. He has been dealt the injustice by the fool Nabal, who tells him to piss off and take your men and your horses with you, because I'm not paying you anything. So Nabal's death is the work of no human hands, because God apparently kills him. It's interesting. David, the aggressor, is rendered as the aggrieved party, and Abigail can no longer be seen as a victim, but becomes a willing participant and a willing newlywed to David. And as the story emphasizes more than once, but it's in fact divine punishment landed on Nabal. And how do we evaluate these claims in this story? If this is the life of David that's being given to us in scriptures, a man who I believe there's no reason to believe did not exist. There's every reason to believe he did, and we're going to get into that throughout this little series. We begin by recognizing that the Bible is not objective history, nor was it ever intended to be. Now, this is going to fly a little bit in the face of what I said about the history in the Bible. When I was talking about the Exodus, I said, I believe the Bible is filled with faith stories wrapped around efficacious history. Now, let me reconcile that with what I'm saying right now, is that the Bible in this case is objective history. The historical story is the same, but the faith story, the apologetic story that the writers want you to know, is wrapped around the historical event. So I think the event itself is history. History is amoral. It's not right or wrong. It just is what it is. How we interpret it and how it's being used, and in this case, being used objectively. It's just stated baldly. The Bible is not history. It's the Bible. And I would say that even the stuff I said in Exodus, the Bible is not history. It's the Bible. The history within the Bible can be efficacious, however. The biblical narrative breaks most of the fundamental rules of modern history writing. And we find in the biblical story presented as facts aspects that no historian could ever know. Think about this. When you read some of these biblical stories, unverifiable elements, unquantified moments, including events that occurred behind closed doors, dialogues, and even internal monologues. David said to himself, I think I shall turn in the way here, because the Spirit of the Lord has led me to go that direction. How do we know that? Unless David told you later and it was recorded. We find characterizations of the various individuals in the story that are far, far, far from unbiased accounts of people. And perhaps most notably, we find the introduction of divine intervention as an explanation for the course of events. And we can hardly blame the biblical author for failing to follow conventions of history, writing that developed history writing that developed thousands of years later. And it was a piece of modern history writing. It may be describing the past, and in that sense, it's historical in nature, but it describes the past using conventions more familiar to us from the genre of historical fiction. This could be, reading the story of David could be like reading Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, about Merlin and Arthur and Morgan and some of these characters. We say that now, I believe David was a real character. Arthur, maybe. Merlin, most probably a title, not a name. So to make that comparison, these conventions serve a very particular purpose. In our case, for the story of David, they glorify and they idealize the Bible's character in this story and most prominent hero, which is David. And the aspects of this narrative that are foreign to the modern genre of history writing, those that are more biblical than historical, all work toward the same ends. Those that are more biblical than historical work to the same ends. They denigrate Nabal and they raise up David. And this can hardly be a coincidence. And nor should it be surprising that David is the unparalleled hero of the Hebrew Bible. He's the king against whom the Bible measures all subsequent kings and who stands unsurpassed by any who followed him. He is, as we've seen, the symbol of Israel's incessant history, establishing that he is the father of the messianic line. And we shouldn't be surprised that the biblical version of his life is weighted in his favor. That, my friends, is apologetics. We have to recognize that the Bible, when we look at these stories, especially of heroes like David, they're products of human minds. And they're like all literature, they're subject to the biases and to the agendas, the conscious and the unconsciousness of its authors. Somebody will come along and say, well, the Bible is inspired by God. This is all the word of God. Well, God had to use people, even if this is so. He had to use people to write. And where we have seen things like, now I'm going to bring this up again, when I talked a couple of weeks ago about how the Bible, in the abortion issue, God was actually pro-abortion in that he allowed for, in the Levitical law, if a man suspected his wife of sleeping with another man and thinks she might be pregnant, he can take her to the priest, who will take scrapings off and Travis, if you're still sitting out here, this is magic. He would take scrapings off the dirt of the tabernacle floor, mix it with water. Then he would have the woman read an oath, and she would drink this water. And if she was, and that's the magic, the intent. And if she was pure, she would survive. If she wasn't, this would probably kill her, was the idea. And so what would happen is the baby would abort, the woman might die or become very ill. But God would protect them both if she wasn't lying. Now, the problem is that the mandate was also extended to a man who only merely suspected that his wife possibly could have had an affair with a guy. And he can have her follow the same mandate and have this spell cast by the priest and have all this stuff happen because she's suspected by her husband. There's never any prohibition against the husband. It's only the husband suspecting the wife. Because God, as I've been told, was favoring the cultural mores and values of his people. And I would say, but why, if God called his people to be unique? Supposedly, he called the Jews to be the children of Israel. They were his people. They were to be unique among the nations, but not so unique as to give up their stupidity. God said, you can still hang on to that. But he was willing to kill and abort babies. Where was the sanctity of life for the unborn when God said that baby will die if you are guilty of adultery? Where was the sanctity of life when God prophesied that the baby born to Bathsheba because of her adulterous affair with King David would die? Why is the punishment of the parent extended to the unborn when God is supposed to be the God of the sanctity of life? So this is where you can also see, what about man who cheated on his wife? Anonymous X asks. That's the point. There was nothing there for the man who cheated on his wife. So this is a God who was a God that did not have the kind of sanctity of life that we like to attribute to him now. So the Bible is a product of human minds. And this is what I mean by that. And scholars of literature call this kind of reading with a hermeneutic of suspicion. And what that means is that they're being aware that the conclusions to which a piece of writing leads are those to which its author wants us to be led. Got that? And stepping back to ask how and why such efforts were made. we first have to remove the non-historical pro-David elements from the story to expose the basic events underneath. And when we do this, it's harder to maintain the overwhelmingly positive picture of David that we get from the Bible. When you take the apologetic away and give the bare story without the names in place, you get a picture in this first story I gave you of Nabal and his wife. Take all the names out, take David out, get a picture of a group, a bunch of gangbangers who went in and extorted a family, and the guy dies as a result. And the leader of the gang marries the woman, gets all the guy's property. Boom. Sounds a little Godfather-ish to me. Hey, Rocky, if you're still out there, that sound like anything you're aware of that you're familiar with, huh? So it doesn't sound like the New Testament God. No, it doesn't. It's written. Is this written in the old book that the Vatican owns? Anonymous, this is written in the Old Testament. This is in the book of 1 Samuel. You say you believe in God and Jesus Christ is in spirit, not from the book. I get that. I understand it. So this is the apologetic that we're starting to see. And I use this story to explain to you exactly what this apologetic is and why it's there. And if you look at this story again, in the case of David and Nabal, we're left with the stark sequence of events as presented at the beginning of this introduction. And when we attempt to understand those events from an objective historical perspective, we're left with the strong possibility that David may in fact have been running a protection racket, may have in fact killed Nabal, and may in fact have covered up his acquisition of Nabal's property by marrying the widow Abigail. And given this potentially damning depiction of David, it's no wonder that the biblical authors went to such length to render the story in a very pro-David's term. To use a modern analogy, the Bible narrative may be considered the ancient equivalent of political spin. It's a retelling, even a reinterpretation of events, the goal of which is to absolve David of any potential guilt and to show him in the most positive light possible. It's as if he's running for president. And as spin, it's been remarkably effective. It's no small part for the simple reason that it's from the Bible. The revelation of private thoughts, conversations and events, the characterizations of the participants, the divine intervention, all of these things, and with them the decidedly pro-David interpretation of the events, have been taken as representing the historical truth, or at the very least, the moral truth. You get into the Jewish historian Josephus, and he retells this story in the first century, and he plays up Nabal's wickedness and David's innocence. He says, I've got it written here, Nabal had died through his own wickedness and had given David revenge. While David himself still had clean hands, the wicked are pursued by God, who overlooks no act of man, but repays the good in kind, while he inflicts swift punishment upon the wicked. Now, the ancient rabbis, perhaps realizing that the biblical account did not sufficiently justify Nabal's death, devised a number of rationales that aren't even found in the text, from greed to pride to idolatry. And Matthew Henry's commentary on this chapter from the early 18th century portrays David as exceedingly humble in his request and emphasizes his need. He says, David, it seems, was in such distress that he would be glad to be beholden to him, Nabal, and did in effect become begging at his door. What little reason we have to value the wealth of this world when so great a churl as Nabal abounds and so great a saint as David suffers want. And ironically, while post-biblical readers and commentators brought into the David spin in Samuel, other biblical authors writing about David were made uncomfortable by it. the author of the book of Chronicles in the Old Testament, one of the latest books of the Hebrew Bible, seems to have recognized that even when interpreted in favor of David, the events described in Samuel are still rather unpleasant. And they're unpleasant stories to be telling about Israel's glorious king. Thus, in Chronicles, we find no trace of the David and Nabal story. In fact, David's entire time in the wilderness, which occupies 12 chapters in Samuel, is reduced to a list of warriors who went to the wilderness to support David as king. And it's noteworthy that these men are described as warriors. This is the chronicler's revision of Samuel's description of David's band as every man who was bitter of spirit. There you see apologetic right there, change from one book in the Bible to the next. And any potentially negative aspect of David's life and actions to be found in the books of Samuel, down to the smallest detail, is fully expunged in Chronicles. And the David of Chronicles is unimpeachable. He's white as snow. He's been purged with hyssop and made clean washed and become whiter than snow. And this seems to be precisely what the chronicler had in mind when he wrote the narrative of Samuel. Our modern cultural memory of David then stands in a long line of idealization and reconstruction. It's the spin of Samuel to the cleansing of David's image in Chronicles, to the messianic connection in the New Testament, all the way up to the present day. The historical David has been successfully and successively diminished, replaced by the legend we're now familiar with. So David was a real man who was a real hero, but who is also a real invention. And I want to go into this more over the coming days. We'll hit this some more about David. And we have to start recognizing that even the Bible presents an idealized David. And the Bible is the only written source of information we have about David's life. We have very little we know about him. We're just starting to even get archaeological evidence that the man existed when the biblical story said he existed. So we know he existed. We know there was a Davidic house in Israel. We know there was a Davidic administration. We're starting to see things about Solomon, we're finding, the son of David, which might even be an apologetic itself, which we'll get to when we get there. The very existence of the biblical spin that argues in favor of David's existence, there's no need to spin a story of this king. There's no reason to spin a story that has no basis in reality. Apologetics aren't written about fiction. Apologetics are written about real characters. And if the fundamental aim of the spin is to say it may seem that the event happened one way, but it really happened another way, then there has to have been an actual event in the first place. And who, given the chance to create a legendary figure from the past to serve as an ancestor and model, would invent a story such as that of David and Nabal? When the stories in the two books of Samuel are understood as pro-David spin, the question of David's existence is rendered moot. He must have existed for the text to look like this. And the stories about David must have been written relatively soon after the events they describe, for they're grounded in the assumption that their audience already knew something about these events. Because if they didn't know about the events, you wouldn't have to spin the event. See? The task then is to find the middle ground between accepting the biblical narrative at face value and rejecting them altogether. And this entails the whole digging process, the digging beneath the pro-David spin of the books of Samuel, removing, as we dig with the David and Nabal story, those elements of the narrative that we recognize as pretty much generically non-historically. It's historical. And in order to access the fundamental events of the past, and then trying to reconstruct the more likely story of what really happened. In doing this, it's important to remember that the history of David, the historical David, was part of a very different place and time, the ancient Near East. I've always said about David, the thing to keep in mind about David is that he is an ancient Middle Eastern monarch in the making. And the legendary David is more of the marble statue version than the living person. And he's more of a symbol than a man. The historical David, by contrast, he's ambitious. He's clever. He's persuasive. He's threatening. And not always in power, but almost always in control. And he's not someone we might even want to emulate, but he's someone that we might recognize. So this David, he's a model. He's a mirror. And the story that about him in the Bible is something we become culturally invested in. It's a particular view of David as a central figure in the founding of both a nation and a religion and the line of the Messiah. Past, present, and future are all tied into this picture of David in the Bible. He's the original man after God's own heart. This is the stuff I want us to get. Not for any other reason that I think it's important for us to understand who these people were and what we're seeing in these characters in the biblical scriptures. It's because the idealized David is important to us now that the historical David has any significance at all. And to rediscover the historical David is to realize that behind the accumulated legend, there was this living, breathing man in a distant place and time whose deeds and the telling of them were responsible for much of who we are today. It's this link across the millennia that makes the search for the historical David both risky and necessary. Just like any other character, the search for the historical Moses, risky and necessary. I don't think we should write these characters off just because they're biblical characters. But in doing this, we have to allow tradition to eclipse the past in which it's rooted. In some parts of the past, the Exodus from Egypt, as an example, which we just recently have been reading about and talking about, might never be recovered. Their history might be gone forever. And the tradition is all we have. And little tidbits of information that seem to create a circumstantial history. We may never know the truth. But we're defined by the distance between what happened and how we tell the story. And it's therefore necessary to know what happened and what didn't happen and how to tell the two things apart. So that's the introduction to what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be talking about David off and on. And I hope this is interesting stuff to you. I wanted to take him because he was a hero of mine of the faith. And then to find out he was a real guy that has meat on the bones of the biblical story was intriguing. I will cut to the chase and say in Baden's book, when he talks about David, he says, in his conclusion in the book, he says, David is probably a guy that many of us would not have liked. The Bible gives a very different picture of him in its apologetic, but he was a Middle Eastern king in the making. And he's somebody who was bloodthirsty. He was nasty. He was terrible. He was terrifying. He was intimidating. He was feared. He was a murderer. He was an adulterer. Probably adultery, one of the least nasty things on his list. In a way, he was a usurper of the throne. So this is an interesting guy. This King David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the man who chased after God's own heart, the man who wrote the book of Psalms, was also this very real person who we probably wouldn't like because he was probably a pretty dastardly fellow. So that's where I'm going to leave this for tonight. We're going to come back to David. Maybe not tomorrow. If all goes well, I'll be on with Jeffrey Dougherty tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern for the Consequential Rapscallions with Jeffrey Dougherty. I'll be on in about 15 minutes with Rocky Stucci and the Situation Room. Leslie, I saw him as a hero. I still do, even knowing these things about him. He's a hero, but he's also a very real person. So there we have it. Tomorrow night, Rapscallions or here. One of the two will happen tomorrow night for sure. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. Share this. Like it. Let people know it's here. Go visit my site, scottallenroberts.com. Go visit Rocky Stucci's Streaming Talk Radio. StreamingTalkRadio.com. All our links are there. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for being here. And I'll see you tomorrow night. And see you, if you're around, in about 13 minutes on Rocky Stucci's channel for The Situation Room. Good night, folks. Thanks for being here.